2. Theft. The eighth commandment, one of the two shortest, declares simply, "Thou shalt not steal." Exodus 20, verse 15, Deuteronomy 5:19. Theft or stealing is taking another man's property by coercion, fraud, or without his uncoerced consent. Cheating, harming property, or destroying its value is also theft. It is not necessary for the robbed to know of the theft for it to be a sin. Thus, to ride a train or bus without paying one's fare is theft, even though the transportation company is unaware of the act. Theft can be accomplished in a number of ways. First, in simple theft, the thief robs the victim directly. Second, in complex but still direct theft, the thief robs the victim as part of a group of thieves. In such a case, a man may not be directly involved in the act of theft, but he is a party to it all the same, as a knowing party in the corporate group of thieves. Third, theft can be accomplished by indirect and legal means, that is, by passing a law which steals from the rich, the poor, or the middle classes for the benefit of a particular group. The state then becomes the agency whereby theft is accomplished, and a pseudo-moral cover is given by legal enactment. Theft is not only the expropriation, legally or illegally, of another man's property against his will or by fraud, but also the destruction of property or the value of property by any willful act or by accident. Thus, to destroy a man's house by arson is theft, but it is also theft if the house is burned down by carelessness. To damage a man's automobile is to rob him of its value. In this area, restitution has been made more or less mandatory by the insurance laws of various states. Because inflation weakens or destroys the values of paper currencies, inflation, too, is very definitely a form of theft. Fraud, too, is clearly theft. A man may willingly purchase an item under the impression that it is what it is represented to be, but fraud on the part of the seller makes it clearly theft. To sell a man watered milk is theft. Pure food and drug laws, however much abused today, are still valid laws in terms of Scripture. However, a corrupt people begets a corrupt state, which then cannot enforce even the best of laws without corruption. Necessity does not justify theft. Necessity cannot give man any priority over God's law. However, some Roman Catholic thinkers, following the Greek natural law tradition, have given moral countenance to theft in times of necessity. Quote, "Thus, one in danger of death from want of food or suffering any form of extreme necessity may lawfully take from another as much as is required to meet his present distress, even though the possessor's opposition be entirely clear. Neither, therefore, would he be bound to restitution if his fortunes subsequently were notably bettered, supposing that what he had converted to his own use was perishable. The reason is that individual ownership of the goods of this world, though according to the natural law, yields to the stronger and more sacred right conferred by natural law upon every man to avail himself of such things as are necessary for his own preservation." End quote. Such a perspective gives man's life priority over God's law. It is said that under the influence of Pharisaism and the interpretations of lawyers, quote, "it was not considered a crime to steal from a Samaritan or another thief." End quote. In this concept of the law, the quote-unquote rights of covenant man were deemed to be greater than those of lesser man. In either case, whether with respect to Delany or the Pharisees, the error is in giving man priority over God's law. Such a position, in effect, nullifies the law. Thus far, our definition of theft is incomplete. It must be added that theft is one form of violation of God's fundamental order. Theft is therefore more than an offense against another person, it is an offense against God. God requires us to respect the life, marriage, and property of our neighbor and enemy. Not because our neighbor or enemy is not possibly evil, and not because our own needs are not great, but because his law order takes priority over the conditions of man. Neither the nature of our neighbor's character, which may be evil, nor our own need, which may be great, can justify theft. The sovereignty of God requires the priority of his law word. Park recognizes that this commandment, quote, "is the protection which the diligent and prudent have against the idle and careless," end quote. All the same, he adds, quote, "Thinking men strive toward an application of this commandment which will ensure that the products of industry will be fairly divided, that the rules may ensure that each man shall have his fair share of the good things of this life." End quote. Park, as one of these quote-unquote thinking men, does not define every man's quote-unquote fair share. Is it that which each man earns, or is it a quote-unquote fair share in terms of the non-biblical principle of equality? A new principle of justice has replaced God. It is quote-unquote thinking men. The humanism of Delaney's position is sometimes justified from Scripture by citing Proverbs 6:30-31. It is thus important to analyze this passage. DeLeach has, in his commentary, clarified both the text and its meaning by setting it in its context, the condemnation of adultery. Quote, "The thief and the adulterer are now placed in comparison with one another, in such a way that adultery is supposed to be a yet greater crime." 30. One does not treat the thief scornfully if he steals to satisfy his craving when he is hungry. 31. Being seized, he may restore sevenfold, give up the whole wealth of his house. A sevenfold compensation of the things stolen is unheard of in the Israelitish law. It knows only of a twofold, fourfold, fivefold restoration. Exodus 21:37, Exodus 22:1 in the King James Version, Exodus 22 verses 1-3 and verse 8. This excess over that which the law rendered necessary leads into the region of the free will. He, the thief, by which we are now only to think of him when bitter necessity has made such, may make compensation sevenfold, that is, superabundantly. He may give up the whole possessions of his house, so as not merely to satisfy the law, but to appease him against whom he has done wrong, and again to gain for himself an honored name. What is said in verses 30 and 31 is perfectly just. One does not condemn a man who is a thief through poverty. He is pitied. While the adulterer goes to ruin under all circumstances of contempt and scorn. And theft may be made good, and that abundantly, but adultery and its consequences are irreparable. End quote. Thus, Scripture gives no ground for violating God's law order. Men are required to work within it for their own welfare and prosperity. To defy or despise God's order is to incur God's judgment. It also brings a sorry return on man's act. An old Spanish proverb declares, "He that spits up to the sky will get it on his face." God's order clearly includes private property. It also clearly approves of godly wealth. The Hebrew words translated as wealth have also the meanings of strength, resources, goods, and prosperity. According to Proverbs 13 verse 11, wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. The warning of Scripture is against the proud who forget God in their wealth, not against the fact of wealth. Deuteronomy 8:17-18. God blesses his saints with prosperity and wealth, as witness Job, Abraham, David, Solomon, and others. One of the possible blessings on obedience to the law is wealth. Psalm 112 verse 3. It is arrogant and ungodly wealth which is condemned. James 5:1-6. The declaration concerning the rich and the needle's eye is commonly misused. Its point is that no man can save himself. Salvation is impossible with men because it is wholly the work of God. Mark 10:23-27. Wealth is an aspect of God's blessing of his faithful ones. The blessing of the Lord it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it. Proverbs 10:22. The godly pursuit of property and wealth is thus fully legitimate. As we have seen in Proverbs 13:11, the means for gaining wealth is labor. This is again emphasized in the New Testament, St. Paul declaring, "Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth." Ephesians 4:28. The Berkeley version renders this as follows: "The thief must steal no more, but rather toil to earn a living with his own hands, so he may have something to give the person in need." Very clearly, work and stealing are opposed to one another as differing approaches to property. Equally clearly, an obligation of all who work is not only self-support, but also charity to those in need. Theft as a shortcut to the possession of property seeks not only to bypass work as the means to wealth, but also to deny the validity of God's law order. In terms of Scripture, wealth can be acquired by labor, inheritance, or gift. A thieving order will oppose all three means of acquisition. A thieving order will concern itself with charity at the price of God's law. It is easy for those who advocate changes damaging to private property to document the evils and the sins of great corporations, wealthy men, and of social orders in which these predominate, but it is at least equally easy to document the sins of the poor as of the wealthy, to cite the evils of a worker as of a capitalist, and to call attention to the depravity of the reformers. Because a man is evil, rich or poor, makes no difference to God's law. He must still be dealt with under the law. When our neighbor is a thief, we acquire no right to rob him of anything he may have. The corrective to theft is not theft. Yet we are told that, quote, "the direction of justice then emerges wherever adjustments and changes take place in favor of the relatively powerless by a change in the distribution or dispersion of the social power of property, a change in the distribution of the control of property," end quote. This is humanism again. It is the exaltation of man's need above God's law, and man as a sinner is hardly to be trusted when it comes to defining his quote-unquote needs. Too often, man defines his covetousness as his need. How often has sinful man admitted to his need for judgment? There is no law where every man is his own lawmaker and court. The relationship of work to charity has been cited. True charity and love towards one's neighbor is the fulfilling of the law, Romans 13, 8-10. In terms of this, Calvin wrote of the eighth commandment, quote, "Since charity is the end of the law, we must seek the definition of theft from thence. This then is the rule of charity, that everyone's rights should be safely preserved, and that none should do to another what he would not have done to himself. It follows, therefore, that not only are those thieves who secretly steal the property of others, but those also who seek for gain from the loss of others, accumulate wealth by unlawful practices, and are more devoted to their private advantage than to equity. Thus rapine is comprehended under the head of theft, since there is no difference between a man's robbing his neighbor by fraud or force." End quote. The basic charity is thus to live in faithfulness to the law with respect to our neighbors and enemies, respecting their God-given immunities under the law. To minister to their distress by gifts is also an important aspect of the law, but in neither case can man separate or oppose charity and law. Calvin further defined charity as against theft in these words, quote, "Moreover, let us communicate to the necessities and according to our ability alleviate the poverty of those whom we perceive to be pressed by an embarrassment of their circumstances. Lastly, let every man examine what obligations his duty lays him under to others, and let him faithfully discharge the duties which he owes them. For this reason, the people should honor their governors, patiently submit to their authority, obey their laws and mandates, and resist nothing, to which they can submit themselves consistently with the divine will. On the other hand, let governors take care of their people, preserve the public peace, protect the good, punish the wicked, and administer all things in such a manner as becomes those who must render an account of their office to God the Supreme Judge. Let the ministers of churches faithfully devote themselves to the ministry of the Word, and let them never adulterate the doctrine of salvation, but deliver it pure and uncontaminated to the people of God. Let them teach not only by their doctrine, but by the example of their lives. In a word, let them preside as good shepherds over the sheep. Let the people on their part receive them as the messengers and apostles of God, render to them that honor to which the Supreme Master has exalted them, and furnish them with the necessaries of life. Let parents undertake the support, government, and instruction of their children as committed by God to their care. Nor let them exasperate their minds and alienate their affections from them by cruelty, but cherish and embrace them with lenity and indulgence becoming their character, and that obedience is due to them from their children has been before observed. Let juniors revere old age, since the Lord has designed that age to be honorable. Let old men, by their prudence and superior experience, guide the imbecility of youth, not teasing them with sharp and clamorous invectives, but tempering severity with mildness and affability." End quote. Calvin further listed duties of workers and masters and every class of men. For men to withhold work, duty, honor, or due service is to steal. Quote, "In this manner, I say, let every man consider what duties he owes to his neighbors, according to the relations he sustains, and those duties let him discharge." End quote. The law speaks with reference to all men. Quote, "Moreover, our attention should always be directed to the legislator, to remind us that this law is ordained for our hearts as much as for our hands, in order that men may study both to protect the property and to promote the interests of others." End quote. The laws against theft thus protect not only God's order but all men who are honest and law-abiding, and they protect even the dishonest from lawless punishment. Why then do men attack this law and the doctrine of property which the law affirms? A century ago, in his general survey of the law, Wines noted, quote, "There are two principal sources of political, as of personal, power, knowledge and property." End quote. This is the heart of the matter. Property is a form of power, and wherever power is claimed for the state, there private property will be under attack. The attack on private property can take two basic forms. First, by denying God's law, powerful individuals can despise the property rights of weaker individuals. The social Darwinism which prevailed in the United States and elsewhere after 1860 led to quote-unquote robber barons who used their power to trample law underfoot. These men justified their lawlessness by appealing to evolution and the quote-unquote struggle for survival. The social Darwinists held that, quote, "the cultural and the biological progress of advanced peoples is assured so long as the law of competition is allowed to operate freely, and in respect to the human species, to assume the form of a struggle for existence which only the strongest survive." End quote. The social Darwinists had no real interest in private property. Their concern was to use the theory of evolution as a guide for society. It became a tool for justifying massive theft. Second, other evolutionists began to emphasize, quote, "the plasticity and creativity of man, of the dynamic character of an environment, and of the reciprocal relation between it and man." End quote. For them, the state became this quote-unquote dynamic environment whereby man could remake himself. Property for these evolutionists is simply a tool whereby the state shapes man and the world. As a result, property is again under lawless attack, first from individuals and corporations, now from the state. Since property is a form of power, the totalitarian state seeks to control or to seize private property in order to prevent the people from having any power independently of the state. But private property is a power which God entrusts to man as a stewardship, because it is God's intention that man should have and exercise power unto the end that the earth be subdued, and man's dominion over the earth under God be established. God gives to the state its due power in its domain. Private property is a power given to man to be used under God and to his glory.